like many of you, I guess, no, there are four of us using the same internet connection here at home. So I will reduce my bandwidth usage by turning off my video because there's a chance that I will be cut off. No, okay. But I hope I'm coming to you as clear as possible, at least audio-wise. Okay naman?
Yes po, sir. Clear po.
Okay. Maraming salamat. Thank you again for the invitation. And this morning, in less than 20 slides, I wish to go through the essential information you need to know about climate change as both a global phenomenon and a local issue that we have to contend with. I hope to provide the backdrop of why climate expenditure tagging is important and having all government institutions be mindful of their individual roles in making our communities resilient to climate change. Siguro by now, everyone is familiar with what is happening with our planet. Essentially, what is the mechanism behind climate change is what is called as the greenhouse effect or the greenhouse gas effect. The increase in surface temperature of the entire globe, as of the moment we have increased the temperature, surface temperature of the entire globe by about 1 degree already, is due to the fact that we are increasing the emission of what are called as greenhouse gases or GHG, which acts like a shield in our atmosphere that essentially contains all the heat that is coming from the sun and keeping it within the earth itself. The increase in GHG means the increase in the greenhouse effect and therefore a continuous increase in surface temperature, which is what we now call as global warming. You may have noticed that media has veered away from the term global warming, and instead we now use climate change, or maybe even more appropriately, climate emergency, because global warming is simply one component of a slew of different changes that are happening in our climate. And therefore, global warming is not synonymous per se with climate change, but it is one of the impacts of climate change. What are the different greenhouse gases that contribute to the greenhouse gas effect? In total, the main greenhouse gas that is in operation is carbon dioxide, consisting of 82% in terms of its effect, followed by methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. The main sectors that contribute the most carbon dioxide into our atmosphere come from the electricity sector, because every time that we produce electricity using fossil fuels such as coal, petroleum, and even natural gases, we emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Next to the electricity sector is transportation, because our transportation is practically running using fossil fuels, gasoline and diesel. Both are, after combustion in our engines, will also emit carbon dioxide in the process. 20% of the greenhouse gases come from industries, because they also use a lot of electricities. 9% coming from agriculture, in particular, raising of cattle produces a lot of methane in the process, because cows, being ruminant animals, they also produce methane other than carbon dioxide. 5% coming from the commercial sector and as well as the residential sector. Now, climate change is a global phenomenon, and although we have to contend with the impacts of climate change locally, we always have to have a global view of the situation. This is a map that shows you which countries are emitting the most carbon dioxide into our atmosphere as of the present time. You can see now, based on the sizes of the circles representing each country, and also you may want to look at the arrow underneath each number. For example, for China, it is emitting about 7.7 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually. Actually, they have increased emission already in the last few years, and this value now is closer or even higher than 10 billion tons of CO2 per year. The arrow underneath represents the increase in uh, carbon dioxide emission. Okay, and therefore you can see that China is still increasing emission. China is followed by the United States with more than 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide emitted every year, but it is slowly decreasing its emission by 7%. Where's the Philippines in all these emission scenarios or emission sources? The Philippines contributes roughly 70 million tons of CO2 per year. This is not even 0.1 of a percent of the total global carbon dioxide emission. And rightly so, I guess many people will say, how come we are very mindful of our emissions, not through our nationally determined contributions, when in fact, even if we reduce all our carbon dioxide emissions to zero, then the impact will even be less than 0.1 of a percent. Number one, the problem is global in nature, and therefore the concerted effort of all countries are required and not just the big emitters. Number two, we have to set an example to our fellow countries that even if our contributions is small, we are doing our fair share of reducing carbon dioxide emission. Another way of looking at greenhouse gas emissions, other than how I showed you in map form, is in terms of a bar graph. And here on the left side, you can see China again leading. No, this bar graph is using a different unit of measure, in parts per million contribution. But you can see China and the US and the whole of the European Union leading the way in terms of emissions. Many countries, including China and India, contend that it is unfair for us to be ranking countries in terms of total emissions per country. It has to be on a per capita basis because it is not their fault, for example, for China to have more than 1 billion population. And therefore, the bar graph on the right side are emissions on a per capita basis, ibig sabihin, on a per person basis. And now you will now have a totally different point of view of which countries require a lot of cutting down in terms of emissions, because Australia and the United States and Canada are emitting more on a per person basis compared to the countries such as China and India, which simply have more people, in their countries. This is the same argument that is being used by developing nations. In other words, many of the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide are the developed countries, obviously, because their industries are developed. And therefore, if we start cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions, in our case, as a developing nation, then we may be stifling the development of our industries in the process. Nevertheless, in this day and age, there are a lot of alternatives in such a way that we are able to develop our different sectors, the industry sector, for example, without compromising or increasing our greenhouse gas emissions. Here's a slide that simply outlines all the impacts brought upon by climate change: increase in temperature, changes in rainfall patterns, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and extreme climate events. As mentioned to you earlier, global warming is just one of the impacts of climate change, which is number one. But if you will ask me, the main impact really in the Philippines would be in terms of the changes in rainfall patterns, as you will see later on. Sea level rise is also important. Ocean acidification is a long-term future impact that when that happens, it will have massive catastrophic changes that will occur in our marine environment. And obviously, number five, extreme climate events, super important for a country like ours, which is the typhoon capital of the world. Now, this slide shows you different organizations trying to rank the various countries that are most affected or most vulnerable to climate change. Iberdrola is a Spanish think tank, and they mentioned Puerto Rico, Pakistan, the Philippines, Haiti, and Myanmar as being the most affected countries by climate change. On the right-hand side, I believe this is a New York Times article, and they mention Nigeria, Haiti, Yemen, Philippines, Kiribati, and UAE. And finally, this is a CNN article that lists down the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world: Ethiopia, Philippines, and so on and so forth. What is common in all these three rankings? It's that the Philippines is always part of it, along with Haiti. There is no argument anymore that the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable and probably the most to lose when climate change kicks in and affects every sector of our society. This is also the reason why we are active both internationally and locally in terms of promoting the various solutions to climate change. Mind you, climate change will be affecting our communities not only because of these new changes that will happen in our climate, but it also tends to exacerbate or intensifies already pre-existing problems that we have. For example, flooding that we are already facing. With climate change, we will have to deal with higher floods and more frequent flooding. We also count food security as an issue, and with climate change, our ability to feed our communities will also be compromised because of climate change. In other words, there are already pre-existing problems in our country, and with climate change, these problems will simply intensify. Now, this slide is a little bit more technical, but I hope you get to appreciate it, because one issue that is always hurled at to those that are promoting climate change mitigation and adaptation is that climate change is a slow onset problem. It is a problem in the future. No, it has not happened yet, and the impact is very slow, so slow that we are able to respond to it in time. No, unlike an earthquake, for example, or a volcanic eruption, where you will have to respond right away. No. So I would like to, using this slide, to dispel the notion that climate change will only happen in the future. Number one, it is already happening. And number two, and I think this is most important now of all the information that I'm providing to you this morning, is that there is what is called as the climate tipping point. Okay, so let me discuss what this climate tipping point is. And this is the reason why urgency in terms of solving and adapting to climate change is of utmost importance to us. So in previous slides, I mentioned to you that there is already a one-to-one correspondence between carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and the change in temperature on the surface of the Earth. The more CO2 that we emit to the atmosphere, the higher the temperature change we will experience here on the surface. No? And therefore, we can represent that as a straight line. More CO2 means increase in temperature. So far, since 1880, we have recorded a little more than 1 degree change in the average surface temperature of the Earth. This seems to be small, no? It's almost negligible. Parang isang click lang yan sa air conditioning unit ninyo, right? And the increase so far that we are recording because of the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere is about 0.07 of a degree per decade. So it seems like it's a slow issue, thus called a slow onset problem. However, there is what is called as the climate tipping point. And many scientists put the climate tipping point at 2 degrees centigrade. Ibig sabihin, once we reach a 2 degree increase in our global temperature, no, and we have already increased by 1 degree, so a little less than 1 degree na lang yung kulang to reach that 2 degree, there will be drastic changes that will happen in many of the environments in the world. And that the relationship between temperature change and CO2 will no longer be linear, but instead, temperature change will no longer be dependent on CO2 emission once we reach that climate tipping point. Right now, that tipping point is set at 2 degrees centigrade, but more and more research, and studies are being put out to suggest that the tipping point does not happen at 2 degrees, but actually earlier at 1.5 degrees centigrade. What happens when we reach 1.5 degrees centigrade? It means that even if we cut down on CO2, at that point in time when we reach that tipping point, temperature change on Earth will continue to rise. Why is there a climate tipping point? It's because there are certain areas or regions in the world that will be affected by the increase of temperature at 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade. And from then on, those environments will actually be releasing CO2 on their own and augmenting or adding to the emissions that we are making through our anthropogenic sources. Okay, so let me just point to you 3 climate tipping points that are of importance. Number 1 is the Amazon rainforest, the largest contiguous rainforest in the world. Because of temperature increase, more and more flora are dying. As of the moment, they have permanently lost 17% of the rainforest, and this is increasing as temperature increases. At a certain point, when the loss of coverage of the Amazon rainforest, which has its own microclimate, by the way, when it reaches a certain percentage, it will no longer be able to sustain its own environment, and thus making the loss of forest cover even faster than what it is today, regardless of CO2 or temperature increase anymore, simply because the entire ecosystem breaks down. Once this breaks down, you have a rapid loss of forest cover in the Amazon. This is one of the biggest, single biggest areas that sequester, meaning it gets CO2 from the atmosphere, and we lose that ability, and therefore the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere simply increases. The second tipping point is found in the Eurasian permafrost, in the Siberia, northern Asia region. there are these vast lands wherein what we find are permafrost. This is land that is permanently frozen underneath. As you can see in this picture here, you have that layer of ice underneath. Once we reach a certain temperature, in the permafrost area at 1.5 degrees centigrade, that ice layer will start to melt. And when it starts to melt, it starts to expose the organic rich soils that are kept, or preserved underneath, this layer of ice. And once that is exposed to the atmosphere, it starts to get emitted as carbon dioxide as well. 40% of the area, as we predict, will be thawed by 2100. And this is just less than 80 years from now. And once this layer of permafrost gets thawed, sorry, meron bang questions? Okay, wala. Once this layer of permafrost gets thawed, then we release this abundant, abundant amount of organic materials underneath. And the third tipping point has to do with Arctic sea ice, which actually helps reflect back solar radiation, the sun's radiation back to the back to outer space. Without that layer of ice that acts as a reflector, then the increase in solar radiation or effective solar radiation will be experienced on land, thus increasing temperature on land. So these are climate tipping points that will happen probably in our lifetime, within 2050, certainly within 2100. And therefore, the time for us to act on climate change is now reduced. With my own calculation, I feel that we only have about 20 to 30 years of window of opportunity to solve climate change. Here again, the impacts of climate change, some information that you may want to be available all the time. Currently, 1.5 degree increase already experienced by the Earth since the Industrial Revolution, 0.07 per decade, most likely with some of the climate tipping point areas starting to contribute carbon dioxide. That 0.07 will most likely be somewhere around 0.1 of a degree per decade or even faster. Sea level rise, as many of our communities are coastal communities, sea level rise will also have a big impact in our country. Increase in temperature, again, 1 degree, 1.5 degrees, or even 2 degrees. This has huge implications in terms of our ability to grow crops. More importantly, the increase and corresponding decrease in precipitation. What I mean is during the rainy season, we are bound to have an increase in precipitation. And during our dry months, we are projected to have even drier months. So simply put, the impact of climate change in terms of rainfall would mean drier dry season and wetter wet season. More drought conditions during the dry season and larger potential for flooding during the wet season. That will be the effect of climate change in our country. Sea level rise, as mentioned earlier, total 20 centimeter increase in sea level already recorded, about 2 mm increase per year. This will also be accelerated when temperatures also increase. Ocean acidification, we haven't really talked about this because the issues of flooding and drought are already huge issues that we have to contend with. But this is something that if it happens, when the pH of our ocean water decreases to a level that a lot of our marine organisms are no longer able to thrive, particularly our corals, no, then there will be a huge breakdown in the ecosystem in the near shore or shallow marine environment. And finally, extreme weather events, no, researchers are finding more and more evidence to suggest that the impact of climate change in terms of extreme weather events would be in the intensification of tropical cyclones or typhoons. Not necessarily more typhoons per year, but more likely you will have more powerful typhoons passing by the Philippines. The second impact of climate change in terms of extreme weather events is in the change in typhoon tracks. Whereas before, most of our typhoons will pass by in the northern Luzon area, in Batanes, for example, we are finding, based on statistical data, that the tracks of typhoons are now passing by the Philippines at a lower latitude, meaning not anymore as frequent in northern Luzon, but now more frequent in southern Luzon and Bicol, as well as typhoons passing by Visayas and Mindanao. And finally, more intense El Nino events, which happen on average between 4 and 7 years. Every 4 and 7 years, there is an El Nino event. We are poised to have more intense El Nino events during this time. On to, I think this is my second to the last slide. What are the approaches that we can make to combat climate change? There are two: climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. No, so I summarize these two approaches as being climate change mitigation, meaning fight, meaning we try to avoid emitting even more carbon dioxide, or do programs that will sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and thus reducing CO2 from the atmosphere. Ibig sabihin, we try to combat climate change. And the second one, climate change adaptation. From the word itself, we are just to adapt, meaning we prepare for the inevitable, which is climate change. Just in case climate change mitigation does not help us, in keeping the increase in temperature, global surface temperature, to a minimum. If climate change does happen and we reach the climate tipping points, then all we can do is to adapt. These are interventions to reduce the impact of climate change. And in the climate change expenditure tagging, many of the programs there are CCAs, or climate change adaptation projects, such as food security. Make sure that our food system is secure and is not affected as much by climate change. Water security, environmental stability, and human security through disaster risk reduction and management. In other words, we prepare. If you will ask me what type of projects we should focus on, whether we focus on climate change mitigation or adaptation, I'm still an optimist in terms of the entire globe being able to solve climate change mitigation. But because of the very fact that it depends on other countries whether or not we will be able to respond to the challenges of climate change, in terms of mitigating its impacts, then I will also prepare, knowing fully well that we are one of the most vulnerable countries in the world in terms of climate change. And therefore, I'll focus more on adaptation measures. My last slide for this morning, just some final points. I just want to leave you with some pointers you may want to consider when planning for your climate change mitigation or adaptation programs. Speaking of CCET, Uh, these are recommendations that you may want to take. Number one, ensure the sustainability of programs. Now, programs that will require funding year in and year out, meaning it is not sustainable on its own, are actually less effective than those projects that when you do it, it actually feeds on itself and continues on, without or with minimal intervention in the future. Number two, consider the efficient use of funds by comparing the gains that you will receive to the budget to be spent. In other words, always do a benefit cost ratio on your projects. There's so many projects that are adaptation projects, and yet the gains that are achieved uh, are so small compared to the budget that was spent. And number three, explore programs that capitalize on the expertise of your institutions. No programs such as tree planting and cleanup drives. These are all good, but what I want you to look at is what are the expertise available in your respective institutions, and you may very well be able to do projects that are beyond things that anybody can do. No, in other words, the expertise that are in your institutions will render your entire institution to be more effective in terms of climate change adaptation. One example, for example, that encompasses all these three final points that I wish to relate to you para mas maintindihan ninyo yung sinasuggest ko. There was one community here near UP Diliman that was affected by floods. No, and they wanted one issue that they saw was that their food security was compromised during the big floods. And what they thought of was to make a community garden, no, so that they produce their own food, no. So at that level, parang okay tong idea na to. So food security, so that they are more self-reliant and so on and so forth. No, they were able to get funding from an international organization. I won't mention na lang who and how much they got, but the program started and they were renting, meaning they were paying for a lot that they converted into a garden. So they were paying something like 10,000 pesos for that lot that they converted into a garden. They hired two farmers, no, local farmers, to tend the garden, vegetable garden, of whom they paid 300 pesos per day. So 600 pesos per day on top of the 10,000 pesos rental for the lot. And the two farmers were producing, because it was a small lot area, less than 1,000 square meters. They were producing pechay and sili and so on and so forth. And when I asked how much they are able to produce, no, in terms of value, they produce on average roughly around 120 pesos worth of vegetables per day. Okay, what does this mean? Food security, the concept of food security is correct. The project that they chose to do is probably a maladaptation because, number one, it is not sustainable, because it requires even more funds, no, to produce the food, and they are losing money in the process. The gains that they get, 120 pesos in terms of value, pales in comparison to how much they are spending, and that they did not capitalize on the expertise of their own community, no, because there are much more other programs, no, that they may have very well uh, do instead of their community garden idea, that made the contributions of this international group in terms of funding, run a little bit longer. Fast forward to, I believe, after 1 year, that community garden does not exist anymore. So just be mindful, I guess, of the programs that you will be um, planning for, and it doesn't mean that it is for climate change adaptation, then it is already a good project to pursue. Speaking of CCET, you may want to consider uh, CCET, no, instead of yet another bureaucratic step in our fiscal procedures, because I know climate change expenditure tagging is probably yet another step, another form that you have to fill up. Instead of thinking of it that way, alternatively, you can use the CCET as a planning and strategic tool, in coping with the impacts of climate change. And I personally hope that you choose the latter and not see this as another, another layer or another step in our process, because by doing so, we are able to contribute to a more climate resilient country, in the future, and your institution will be at the forefront in doing climate change mitigation and adaptation programs. I will stop there. I will make sure that I am able to share these slides to you so that you will have these references and resources that you can use when you do your own lectures in your respective institutions, and when you want some guidance, in terms of CCET and planning for your own projects. I hope you learned something this morning. Maraming salamat po, and thank you for listening.